In a land so vast that the wind turns to sighs, a middle-aged man who has lived alone for nearly 2 decades suddenly makes a decision he can't believe. He writes a letter asking for a bride through the post office. He's waiting for a woman who is normal, down to earth, strong enough to endure the harshness of the land. But instead, a woman so beautiful, so mysterious, and so different from everything he's ever prepared for, steps out of a carriage at the ranch gate. If faced with that choice, what would you do? Push that woman away because you think you are not worthy, or keep her, even though you know the past she carries could break your heart again? Have you ever loved so much that you were afraid to love again? Have you ever met someone who made your painful past suddenly want to heal? If that question touches the deepest part of your heart, stay and join me in that man's story. Before we begin, if you find this content touching, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next emotional stories. That afternoon, the wind from the Black Hills swept down into the wide plains behind Reeves Ranch, carrying a faint yellow dust that covered the ground. The dirt road leading to Willow Bend was almost lost in the hot, dry mist. The late afternoon sunlight slid down the porch roof, casting long, bronze streaks on the old wooden table. A lone crow perched on a fence post, calling hoarsely like an echo of the Wild West. Harlan Reeves stood there, his hands on the railing, trembling in the wind, his old boots covered in dust. A frayed cowboy hat hid half his tanned face. At 48, he looked like a wind-carved stone, strong, quiet, and with the lonely look of someone who has lived through too many winters without anyone to look forward to. He looked far away, at the faint line of road that connected his ranch to the outside world. There was nothing but dust, wind, and such a small hope that he almost felt foolish. He said to himself, "She might not come." Harlan wasn't the kind of man who expected much from life. After his wife died of pneumonia nearly a decade ago, he lived as if his heart were buried with her in the red dirt at the bottom of the garden. He wasn't rich. He wasn't handsome by big-town standards. Just a rancher who toiled from dawn to dusk, mending fences, tending horses, tending a small flock of sheep, and living in silence. And that silence lasted so long that it became a shadow over his life. Every evening he ate alone in the empty kitchen, the only sound being the crackling of wood in the fireplace. Every morning the hooves of his horses in the yard were the same rhythm, no other voice but his own sighs. Willow Bend was a few miles from the ranch, but he only went there when absolutely necessary. Harlan lives like the wind can't touch him, the old men at the tavern used to say. Yet a few weeks ago, in a moment of weakness, or perhaps a glimmer of survival instinct, he sent a letter to a marriage agency in the East. In the letter, he wrote that he only needed a woman who was simple, hard-working, understanding of life, willing to live in a place where there's nothing but earth and sky, a normal person, a companion enough, a roof that has the breathing of someone other than himself. That's all. He didn't want love. He didn't dare dream of warmth. He just wanted a presence to pull him out of the darkness of loneliness that had lasted too long. The wind blew harder, carrying the scent of dry grass and hot earth. He gently rubbed his knuckles, the familiar calloused feeling. He chuckled a laugh that was more like a sigh. I was stupid to expect something like that, but he still stood there, because people, no matter how strong, will still wait for something at the end of the day, even if it is just a small light in the long road. Suddenly, in the distance, came the steady tapping of wheels, a dry but clear sound, ringing in the air like a sudden heartbeat. Harlan strained his eyes. Through the dust, a carriage emerged. The leather roof was darkened by the sun. The wheels were caked with dirt, and the wind pulled the dust behind it like a shadowy dragon. Harlan's heart skipped a beat, then slowed, then beat harder. He took a deep breath and adjusted his jacket. His hands trembled with nervousness, a feeling he hadn't felt in years. He wanted to go inside and look at himself in the mirror, but he knew it wouldn't change anything. Western life doesn't favor looks. It only forges a man through sun, wind, and responsibility. The carriage stopped at the gate. Rocks flew up. The horse threw its head back and snorted. The driver, Mr. McCall, a silver-haired man familiar from Willow Bend, leaned back in his seat, squinted at Harlan, and half smiled. "Mr. Reeves, you are in great luck today." Harlan frowned slightly, not understanding. His heart beat faster. He stood up straight, though his shoulders were still shaking from the sun and nervousness. Mr. McCall said nothing more. He just opened the car door. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. The wind stopped on the roof. The wooden stairs shook. The crow fell silent. A slender hand stepped forward. Then a woman appeared, light as a shadow, but so clear that Harlan's eyes widened. The cream-cloth bonnet hid part of her face, but for a second he saw her eyes a greenish-gray like the leaves of a forest on the verge of rain. The face was delicate, the familiar Eastern woman's, but the gaze was downcast, deep and sad, like someone who had lost more than they could ever say. Her dress was ankle-length, not expensive, but carefully mended. Her hands were covered with old, clean gloves. There was something about her posture that was both fragile and strong, a beauty that was not dazzling but unsettling. Harlan was speechless. She was too beautiful, too refined, too different from what he expected. Not a normal person like he had asked for, not someone who would live comfortably in this wilderness, not the kind of woman his life should touch again. A chill ran down his spine. He swallowed softly, his lips moving silently. The woman smiled slightly and bowed politely. "You are Mr. Reeves." Her voice was low, soft, a little shy but clear, like the sound of wind gently touching the glass door. Harlan stood still. He hadn't felt so small in years. After a few seconds longer than a winter, he could only reply with 2 words. "Izumi." She stood there, with a gentleness that his rough life had never touched. And in that moment, Harlan Reeves knew that the simple world he had tried to rebuild had begun to shake. The air in front of Reeves' ranch seemed to freeze as the woman first set foot on the ground. The afternoon sunlight slid off the old boards of the porch, reflecting off her small suitcase, like light trying to cling to something precious in the wasteland. Harlan Reeves stood still, his thoughts racing in uncontrollable directions. He had prepared himself to meet someone ordinary, someone like his own life. And now, her presence made him feel as if he had opened a door and looked into another world. The woman stepped lightly onto the wooden plank, where the dry earth turned to floor. Her movements were slow and gentle, not reserved, but the carefulness of someone who had lived through many changes. When she raised her face, those blue-gray eyes looked straight at him. No avoidance, no haughtiness, just a strange calm, as if she had faced things more difficult than this encounter. "I am Marigold Evans," she said, her voice clear and gentle, enough for him to hear even over the wind blowing through the meadow behind her. Harlan was startled by her name, short and beautiful, like the person standing before him. He opened his mouth to reply, but something caught in his throat. It took him a few seconds to find his voice. "Hello, Miss Evans," he said softly. "The journey from the east must have been difficult." Marigold smiled slightly, a sad but warm smile. "I'm lucky to be here. Mr. Reeves." The answer took him aback, though he wasn't sure what it was that struck him. Perhaps it was the way she considered the effort to come to this strange place as a way to thank life. Perhaps it was her calmness as she entered a land of nothing but wind and silence. Coachman McCall stood nearby, taking off his cap and wiping his sweat. He glanced at Harlan. "I have to get back to town before dark." He wouldn't keep her out much longer. Harlan understood. He nodded his thanks, then stepped aside to keep out of Marigold's way. He didn't dare look at her too long. The fading light and the dust seemed to be pushing him into a situation that his heart couldn't keep up with. "Come in," he said softly, almost afraid his voice would say something too much. Marigold nodded and picked up the suitcase. Her hands, though delicate, did not shake. "Mr. Reeves" was about to step forward to help, but the sight made him pause. It was the self-reliance of someone who had been used to carrying herself for a long time. It made him feel a little heavy inside. He knew what it was like to live alone, to take care of everything, to not bother anyone. She did too, perhaps even more than he did. When he opened the door of the wooden house, he suddenly realized that the atmosphere inside was a bit too empty. The room only had a large wooden table, 2 chairs, a stove, and some basic things. Everything was clean. He had cleaned all morning, but still could not cover the coldness of years of loneliness. Marigold walked in, setting her suitcase down by the wall. She stood still for a few seconds, looking around the room with an unreadable expression, not disappointment, nor amusement. It was as if she were taking in every corner, recording it as part of her new life. "Thank you for your preparation," Marigold said softly. This space was small but warm. That was more important. Harlan was confused. He had never heard anyone refer to his home in such a warm tone. Still, he maintained his usual calm tone. "I'll take you to the room next door. I extended it last month. It's simple, but functional." Marigold nodded and followed him. Each of her footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floor, making the house feel less empty. When he opened the door to the small back room, the smell of new pine wafted in. The room contained only a narrow bed, a small table, and a window that looked out onto the hills. Marigold touched the edge of the bed lightly with her hand, then looked out at the scenery outside. The late afternoon light made her eyes look deeper. I think I might like this place. Harlan felt his heart shrink. He didn't understand why her simple words could make his chest slow a beat. Maybe he was so used to long silences that any sound of trust made him feel awkward. He was about to leave to let her rest, but Marigold suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Reeves, are you worried about my appearance?" Harlan froze. He turned, his eyes wide with surprise. She looked at him, her eyes not blaming, but with the understanding of someone who had seen things. "I know I'm not what you expected," she said slowly, "but I came because I wanted to start a new life. I'm not looking for ease. I'm looking for peace. The West can give me that, no matter how harsh it is." Harlan didn't know how to respond. Her words struck a chord with him. He feared she was too beautiful, too different, too refined for the life he could offer. Finally, he said just one simple sentence. "I don't want you to suffer." Marigold looked at him for a long time. Then she smiled slightly. "No one goes to such lengths to find a disadvantage. I know exactly what I'm choosing." A flowery breeze blew in from the window. The room softened. Harlan felt something in his chest shift again, ever so slightly but clearly. The air between them seemed less stifling. It felt lighter, even though they were still a few feet apart. "Mr. Reeves nodded slowly. "Get some rest. I'll get dinner ready. Call me if you need anything." Marigold bowed her head. "Thank you. Harlan." He was startled when she called his name for the first time. A strange feeling ran down his spine. It was just a simple sound, but it made him feel that something in this house had changed. As he walked out of the room, the door behind him closed softly, almost silently. But for Harlan Reeves, that silence was like a pause that opened a new turning point in his life, a turning point that he himself did not dare to name. The house was no longer just a shelter. It began to breathe the breath of two people. Harlan stood still in the kitchen. The afternoon light was fading. The wind was still blowing outside, but inside the cabin, something felt as if a door had opened, and he knew he was no longer standing alone in the wind. Outside Reeves' ranch, the wind from the hills continued to blow across the meadows, carrying the scent of dry, dew-soaked earth. Inside, Harlan Reeves stood by the stove, rearranging the familiar objects. Every bowl and every cooking utensil was in its proper place, but today they felt a little strange. Perhaps it was because the house had taken on a new breath of life, and he realized he had lived too quietly for too long. Light footsteps behind him made him turn. Marigold Evans appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had taken off her bonnet, her long hair tied back, revealing a more delicate face. Harlan suddenly felt the room lighten. He was not used to having someone stand in the kitchen with him. The feeling was both strange and indescribably reassuring. "Can I help you?" Marigold asked, her voice soft and low. Harlan shook his head, then felt awkward all at once. He didn't want to seem distant, but he was afraid to let her into too much of the familiarity of the ranch. It was a part of his life he'd held on to for so long, as if letting go would throw him off balance. "I'm used to doing it myself," he replied simply. Marigold looked at him for a moment, her eyes not blaming but understanding. She seemed to sense his unspoken concern. She walked lightly to the table, touched the back of the chair to rest her arms, and let out a soft breath. "It's quieter than I imagined," she said, not looking at him, but at the small window in the wall. She touched the tabletop as if it were something precious. I felt as if all the noise was being kept outside the door. Harlan stood still, his hand hovering over the iron pot. He was not used to hearing compliments about his home. Since his wife's death, he had considered it a shelter, with no reason to decorate it or share his feelings with anyone. Now a stranger called it peaceful. A strange feeling crept into his chest, warm and painful, like an old wound touched by the wind. "Can I have a rest?" he asked, his voice low and reserved. Marigold turned. Her gray-blue eyes slowly scanned his face. "Yes. The room suited me. I thought I would get used to it." Harlan nodded, then was silent for a long time. His eyes fell on the kitchen counter, where the thin light from the door spilled in. He wanted to say something kinder, but the words stuck. Life in the West had taught him to do more than talk, but today he realized there were things that would always be heavy in his heart if left unsaid. "Did you have any expectations coming here?" he blurted out, the question coming out so lightly that he almost surprised himself. Marigold did not answer at once. She moved closer to the window and looked out at the distant sea of grass, where the wind made the green patches sway like the sigh of the earth. After a while, she spoke softly. I don't expect life to be easy. In the East, easy doesn't hold anyone. I've lost a lot. When you lose, you find a place where you can stand without falling. Harlan felt her words sink in slowly, like rain falling on dry ground. He knew the feeling better than anyone. Great loss makes people cautious, but caution also exhausts. He cleared his throat lowly. If you need time to get used to this ranch, just let me know. Marigold tilted her head, looking at him with affection, but not the kind of affection that was easy to read. There was something in her gaze that resembled the empathy of two people who had shared their own pain. I'm used to my own time. Just know I'm not a burden here. She replied. The burden. That made Harlan suddenly turn. Look at her for the first time since she arrived. There was something in his eyes that was responsibility, sadness, and silent disapproval. She is not a burden, he said more firmly than usual. Marigold blinked. A look of mild surprise crossed her face, then turned into a small smile, one that made Harlan's heart clench before he could hide it. Thank you, Mr. Reeves, she said slowly. He moved his arm slightly as if to change his position. The emotional experience was too clear and made him uncomfortable. He was used to the sun and wind, to work, to silence, but he was not used to the feeling growing inside him. He lifted the pot lid and checked the stew simmering on the stove. Steam rose, mingled with the scent of beef, potatoes, and parsley. The kitchen smelled warm and cozy, a scent he had not noticed before. I'm not a good cook, he said, stirring gently, but I'll try not to disappoint you. Marigold gently moved closer, not too close, but close enough for her breath to mingle with the warmth from the stove. She looked at the food and nodded. I think this dish will be better than most of what I was offered back home. Her words stopped Harlan's hand. He didn't ask about home, but her eyes spoke louder than words. The years in the East had not been kind. She had not come west for comfort. Perhaps she was escaping a place where her beauty was a burden rather than a gift. Tell me if you need anything. I may be tactless, but I keep my word. Harlan spoke slowly. Marigold looked at him long, then tilted her head as if listening to something in his voice that normal people couldn't hear. She answered softly. I believe you. Those three simple words made Harlan feel like he was standing in the dark and saw a small light in front of him. Faith was the thing he did not expect, but it made his heart waver the most. He turned away to avoid her gaze and continued preparing the meal. Steam rose gently from the pot, but he had never felt a meal so meaningful. Not because of the food, but because of the guest who had just entered his life as a new companion. In that moment, Harlan realized a silent truth. The West taught people to be strong through harshness, but also taught how to let someone into life through very small things. A look, a word, a strange warmth in a familiar house. Marigold Evans' presence was not like a strong wind that shook him. It was like a stream of water coming onto dry land and awakening what he thought was dry. And that made him both more hopeful and more afraid than ever. The atmosphere at Reeves' ranch after the meal seemed to change imperceptibly. Although neither of them said much, the silence was no longer as heavy as before. It was like two people listening to the same soft music from the wind, each breathing their own rhythm but blending together. In the kitchen, the fire had dimmed, leaving a warm red glow like the last breath of a turbulent day. Harlan Reeves rearranged the objects on the wooden table, but his hands were slower than usual. He was conscious of his movements, as if the presence of the woman across the room made him more conscious of how he lived. Before, he had simply done things well enough to survive. Today, he unconsciously wanted to do things a little better, a little tidier. Marigold Evans stood near the window, her hand gently resting on the old wooden frame, cracked by time. Her eyes looked out into the distance, where the shadows of the hills spread into the sky, not to admire the scenery, but to find a new anchor for herself in a life that had drifted many times. Harlan watched her from behind, a strange feeling stirring in him. The old fear remained, but mixed with it was something almost like longing. He didn't know when he had wanted to hear her speak, to see her move, to feel the calm and the hidden sadness she carried. Still, he kept his distance. This land taught him to restrain everything, even the good feelings. He walked closer to the window, standing far enough away from her so as not to cause embarrassment. Does this place make you feel out of place? Harlan asked softly. Marigold turned her head, her blue-gray eyes reflecting the firelight behind her. No, she answered softly. I'm just getting used to the feeling that no one is waiting for me. When you're in a new place, you have to learn to believe in the smallest things before you can believe in the biggest. Harlan frowned slightly. He knew better than anyone what it was like to have no one waiting for him. It felt like an old cinch around his chest, making it a little harder to breathe. He just hadn't thought to tell anyone. He chose a neutral sentence so as not to make her think he was asking too deeply. I think you're strong enough to stand firm in this place. Marigold smiled slightly. Not the kind of smile that lit up the world, but a quiet smile, like ripples on a quiet lake. True strength comes from things unseen, she replied. I'm not sure if I'm strong or not, but I know I still want to try. Harlan looked down at her hand, resting against the door frame. Even a glance made him notice the stark contrast. The hand was beautiful, delicate, as if it were meant to hold spools of embroidery thread, books, or jewelry, not the dust of the West. Yet here she stood, in the simple cabin, facing a life someone like her should never have to enter. That made his heart a little heavier. She had to leave behind a lot, he said, his voice low. Marigold was silent for a moment, as if she were hearing the words in multiple layers. Then she replied softly, I only leave behind things that I can no longer keep. What I want to take with me is hope. It seems that the West is a place where few people still have hope. So it suits me. Harlan almost stopped breathing. She said what he had kept to himself for years. The West was not for those with high expectations. It belonged to those who learned to live with loss and still find a little light. Her words made him feel like someone had opened a door to a long closed room. He wanted to say something to her, but he didn't know where to start. All his life he had been used to letting things flow. Now that he was faced with the soul of a woman who had suffered so much, he felt he had no words. He stepped back a little to catch his breath, then spoke. I'll show you around the ranch tomorrow. It's not a lot, but enough to give you an idea of how the place works. Marigold inclined her head slightly. She did not ask many questions, like the women he had met before. She simply nodded. I want to know. I want to do my part. As long as you don't mind. Harlan shook his head. No, I'm just afraid. He paused, hesitated, then continued. I'm just afraid you'll think I'm not good enough to make you stay. The words made his heart clench. He hadn't meant to say what he had kept to himself, but her presence made the things he had kept hidden for so long easier to say. Marigold looked at him a long time. There was no judgment, no pity. She was looking at a real man, one who had opened a small crack in the wall he had built so long ago. Mr. Reeves, she said slowly, I didn't come here to be convinced to stay. I came here to rebuild what was lost. If you think you're not good enough, maybe we're more alike than you think. The silence was so deep Harlan could hear his own heart. Her words were like a wind down his spine. He had never thought she, a beauty who turned heads, would share his fears. Yet there she stood, speaking of them so calmly. He was forced to see her more clearly, not through his own prejudices or complexes. You are strong, he said softly. Marigold closed her eyes slightly, as if to hide something. Strength comes from the things people don't want to remember. I only carry the parts that can still stand. The tension between them was thick with unspoken words. Harlan knew he couldn't press further. She had just admitted her vulnerability in the most discreet way. To ask for more would be disrespectful. He stepped back a little to take a breath and then spoke. If there's anything you would like changed in the house or on the ranch, just let me know. She tilted her head. I will. But first I want to know more about you, to understand what the owner of this ranch thinks. Harlan paused, as if someone had just placed a hand on the door of a room he had locked for years. He didn't answer right away. What he had experienced, what he had avoided, wasn't easy to talk about. But her gaze wasn't urgent. It was just opening in a direction he no longer feared. Mr. Reeves, she added, I don't need the complete story. Just enough pieces to understand why a man chose to live alone for so long. When he heard that, Harlan knew he couldn't avoid it forever. But he also knew that to tell a story, he needed to wait for the right moment. He replied in a low voice, When I'm ready, I'll tell you. Marigold nodded, respect clear in her eyes. I can wait. A strange warmth spread through Harlan's chest. She didn't press, she didn't probe, she didn't pry. She just stood there in the most peaceful way possible. It made him feel like he was taking a small step out of his shell. Their shadows were etched against the wood. They were closer than either of them dared to admit. And in that silence, Reeves Ranch had a new spirit that even the wind could not carry away. Reeves' ranch unfolded like a map, each fold of land holding the memory of Harlan's years of struggling with life on his own. As Marigold followed him out onto the open land, her shoes a thin layer of dust on them, she gazed at the landscape that stretched before her. Long fences, sparse cactus bushes, hills stretching to the horizon. All were forlorn, but full of hidden vitality. Harlan walked slower than usual, not because he was tired. It was because he hadn't led anyone around the ranch in a long time. Her presence made each step more meaningful, as puzzling as carefully lifting a familiar object just because someone was watching. He pointed to the far stables. That's where I spent most of my time. The horses here are a little nervous around new people, but they'll get used to hearing your voice more often. Marigold looked in the direction he pointed, her eyes lighting up a little. I was used to horses back home, not the Western breed, but I knew how to make them feel safe. The words carried a layer of memory Harlan suspected she wasn't ready to share, but he could see she wasn't the type to come to the West just to find shelter. She wanted to be authentic to this place, not avoid it. A breeze blew by, carrying the scent of freshly pounded earth and the wood of the fence posts. The scent made Marigold tilt her head, as if to remember the feeling. Harlan watched the moment from behind. Something in him crept up, as if the ranch he thought was worn out felt different with her around. As they approached the stables, the chestnut horse named Rowan snorted and took a step back. Marigold stood still, not reaching out to touch, not reaching out as so many did. She bowed her head, letting her voice drop to a whisper. We don't know each other yet, but I won't scare you. What surprised Harlan wasn't the words, but the way she said them, as lightly as a thread laid on wood. Rowan raised his head, his ears twitching for a moment, then stopped avoiding them. Harlan realized what he had long since ceased to believe: the right tone of voice could comfort animals, just as it had comforted him the night she arrived. She has her own way. He spoke slowly. Marigold turned, smiling openly, not in a special way. I just know what it's like to trust someone for the first time. The words made Harlan pause. Once again, she had touched something he had not intended anyone else to touch. Not because she meant to, but because she saw things he had not said. He guided her through the feed store, showed her how to sort the hay, what to set aside when the horses were weak. She observed every detail, not missing a single thing. No pressing questions, no trying to prove herself, just learning. Very quiet, very focused. That suited this land, where people believed in persistent actions over flowery words. After a while, they sat down to rest under the only green tree behind the stable. The canopy was not large, but it provided enough shade from the hot sun. Marigold leaned lightly against the tree trunk, her hands on her knees, her eyes distant. Life here is a little quieter than I expected, Marigold said, her voice low but not sad. It's just, I have to get used to this kind of silence. Harlan looked out at the vast sky before him. It had taken me years to get used to it. The silence of the West was different from the silence of other places. Here, it was not a place to hide from, but to confront. Marigold looked down at her hands. He was right. Sometimes I think what I fear most is silence, because in it I have to hear things I want to forget. Harlan tilted his head. Her words mirrored what he had experienced all those years alone. Loss of his mother. Loss of his father. Loss of his only friend. He had grown accustomed to the sound of the wind whistling around the wooden walls, but he had never really heard it, because listening too closely could hurt. He was about to say he understood, but before the words could come out, Marigold continued. But maybe it was this place that forced me to slow down. I couldn't run anymore. There was a tiny quiver in her face that only the observant could see. Harlan realized it wasn't fear, but recognition. Some pain had passed through her, leaving a void that no amount of noise could fill. He wanted to ask what she was running from, but he did not dare touch the open wound. He spoke softly, as if lighting a small fire in the cold. Ah, if you need time. This ranch has enough room for one to find themselves. Marigold looked at him. For the first time, her eyes were not only silent, but also filled with a hidden gratitude, as if those words had touched the point she feared most, but also hoped for most. I will try, she replied. A long silence opened up. Not heavy, not uncomfortable. Just like two people sitting close to each other by the underground stream of each person's memory. When Harlan stood, Marigold stood with him. She brushed the dust off her dress, her movements soft and slow. Harlan sensed there was something more fragile about her than the appearance of someone who had lived so much. He asked an unexpected question. Do you regret coming here? Marigold bowed her head slightly. A breeze stirred her hair. When she looked up, she answered in a low, steady voice. If I stayed where I was, I would continue to die slowly in silence. But here, at least I feel like I'm breathing again. Harlan clenched his fingers beside him, as if to keep something from falling from his heart. Her words made him understand that this woman hadn't come just to start a new life. She had come to save herself. And for some reason, his ranch was where she'd chosen to stay. That made Harlan Reeves afraid for the first time in a different way. Afraid of not being able to keep the peace for those who needed peace. But for the first time, he also found himself wanting to try. He nodded slightly, his voice dropping. So, we'll start here. Marigold looked at him as if remembering that. It was an unspoken promise, but enough to make her see that there was more than just the cold wind from the west ahead. Reeves' ranch, which had seemed closed for many years, suddenly opened a small door. Through that crack, both of them felt something was beginning to change, though neither of them dared to name it. Near the small garden behind the main house was an empty plot of land that Harlan had not touched in years. It was where he had intended to build a saddle barn, but had abandoned it as his strength and will waned with the wind. When Marigold walked across the plot, she paused for a moment, reaching out to touch some dry grass swaying in the wind. This place looked like it was meant to be, but never was. Her voice was low, not a comment, but a voice that could be heard from the ground. Harlan stood a few feet away. He did not answer immediately. The land was like a corner of memory that he did not touch, for fear of resurrecting something old. He replied slowly, I had thought of building another small house, but then there was no reason to finish it. Marigold turned, her expression neither curious nor pitying, just a quiet feeling, as if she wanted to understand the silence rather than interrupt. What if there was a reason now? Harlan squeezed the hand beside him. The question was like a stone dropped into a long, quiet pond. He looked at the land, then at the woman standing there, her hair shining in the soft sunlight. She wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't forcing him to change. But just by being there, she touched the rocky corners. We can fix this place up first, he said, to keep the grass from growing wildly. Marigold nodded. Her eyes gleamed with something like the feeling of being given the chance to contribute to something larger than herself. They began to clean up. Marigold picked up the rotten stones, her hands careful as if gathering up a forgotten memory. Harlan shoveled the dry soil away, his movements slow but sure. The air between them was unhurried, not compressed, not tense, just two people doing the same ordinary thing, but with a silent companionship in every movement. When Harlan's shovel hit something hard, he bent down to pick it up. It was a large, old piece of wood, with an unfinished horse carved on the side. Marigold looked at the wood for a moment, her eyes deep and gentle. Who carved it? Me. But a long time ago. Is there a reason why you stopped? Harlan had never told anyone about this. But with Marigold's eyes on him, he felt no need to put up a barrier like he did with the others. He sat down on a small tree stump nearby, holding the piece of wood in his hand. A friend's son was here with me. He loved horses, and I told him stories of faraway lands. I was going to make him a present, but he got a fever after a trip with his father. He didn't make it. His voice did not tremble, but there was a deepness that could not be ignored. Marigold did not say anything hastily. She simply sat down beside him, keeping a distance so as not to intrude on his pain. The wood in Harlan's hands felt like it carried the weight of so many things left unsaid. He stared at it until his most haunting memories rose up. The years he'd built a wall of silence around himself, not because he couldn't bear the loss, but because he was afraid of it again. Marigold spoke softly, her voice as light as the wind passing over the hilltop. Not everyone could make others feel safe the way he did with that boy. Harlan looked at her. Not at what she said, but at the way she said it. No embellishment, no praise. Just an acknowledgement of what he had forgotten about himself. Marigold wasn't trying to make him feel better. She simply saw the part of him he had kept hidden. He put down the piece of wood. You know, sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be able to open up again. When you've been alone for so long, you get used to being responsible only for yourself. Marigold was silent for a long moment. Then she replied softly, I believe there are things that just need someone to listen to, make us want to try again. Not because that person is perfect, but because they make us not want to go through the rest of our lives in silence. The words made Harlan's chest tighten. He hadn't thought in a long time that someone understood him so well. Every word she spoke touched on something he didn't dare face, the fear of someone so used to being alone that it was his destiny. he asked, his voice low. Do you think this ranch could be where you belong? Marigold looked up at the hazy sky above. Some places don't need to be perfect to be a destination. Just having someone to stop you from drifting. For me, sometimes peace comes from seeing someone else in the same space. Harlan looked at her face, where the lines softened in the soft light. He had never thought this woman could say things so bravely and so honestly. As for himself, he began to feel the wall in his chest slowly cracking. Not painfully, just opening. Harlan stood, the old shovel in hand. Then we'll make this a place you can stand. We both deserve one. Marigold smiled, a very small smile. Not bright, not showy, but enough to make the land around her seem a little brighter. Together. They continued clearing the abandoned land. No one spoke much, but each movement was a silent promise. As the sky turned paler, they stopped and admired the result. Before them, a cleaner patch of land than before. Not much, but the beginning of something. Marigold stood next to Harlan. She spoke softly, her voice audible across the large space. Thank you for sharing that with me. I know it wasn't easy, Harlan replied. Maybe it's time I let the memories breathe. And she realized he wasn't just talking about the boy from years ago. He was talking about himself. As the abandoned lot cleared, Marigold noticed the first thing that changed, not the landscape, but the way Harlan walked across it. His steps felt a little lighter, no longer as if he were dragging the past with his whole body. Marigold stood beside him, watching the newly cleared land. The wind blew through the short grass in small waves. Harlan touched the handle of his shovel, his eyes scanning the distance, where the ranch line stretched in a straight line before disappearing into the wasteland. He spoke in a low voice. This plot of land was where I had planned to plant some apple trees. My father loved mountain apples, but after he died, I didn't want to plant any more. I was afraid that every time I saw them, I would miss him. Marigold listened to each word as if listening to a stone falling on a wooden floor, a silent echo. She placed her hand on the leveled ground. In a way, it felt like a page someone had left behind. If you fear that because of what you've lost, I think I understand, she said softly. But sometimes, replanting is a way to remind yourself that you can still love something. Harlan didn't turn around right away. He just sighed softly. I'd forgotten what that felt like, of having something to look forward to. Marigold looked at his cheekbones, where time marked them, but did not mar the integrity of a man who had suffered so much. She spoke as if to tell the story. I did too. Sometimes I think I have exhausted my ability to hope for the best. But if I don't try, how will I know if there is any hope left? Her words seemed to draw a new line on that land, the line between what was lost and what was waiting to be found. Harlan picked up the unfinished carving from the old land. He stroked the surface for a moment, then set it back on the ground. Marigold saw in the gesture a peaceful parting with a memory. Not painful, just light. She asked in a very small voice, if he could rewrite the past, just a part, what would he want to change most? He paused longer than she expected. His expression was not stiff with resistance, but sunken, like someone searching for an answer buried deep in the earth. I wanted to keep my father around longer, at least long enough to show him I wasn't giving up. He thought I was too stubborn to love anyone, too closed off to need anyone. I wanted him to know that I wasn't like that. I just hadn't found the right person to stand by. Marigold bowed her head slightly, preventing her heart from beating too loudly. A simple sentence, but it contained a lifetime of fighting loneliness. She understood that not everyone had the courage to admit it, especially a Western man who was used to living among dry wind and salty dust. Harlan set down his shovel, his hands relaxed at his sides, as if relieved of some of the weight. Marigold walked over to the fence. An old board was knocked askew, its corners rotten. She touched it lightly. Harlan, I want to ask something, if you don't mind. He nodded, his eyes fixed on her calmly. She continued, her voice steady but measured. The reason he had chosen to post the ad for a wife, was it because he wanted someone to share his life with? Or was it because he felt he couldn't live alone forever? Harlan took a few beats to answer that, not because he was at a loss for words, but because some questions make you look at yourself. I thought I just needed someone to work with, someone to help me forget the emptiness. But when I met her, I realized that what I needed wasn't someone to fill the void, but someone to make me stop feeling empty. Marigold paused. A feeling she couldn't name crept into her chest. It was light as a breath, yet deep as waves crashing on stone. "I am not the person you expected," she said, her voice low. Not because she was afraid, but because she was afraid that speaking loudly would break the fragile bond between them. No, she was someone I never thought I would have the chance to meet. That scared me more than it pleased me. That answer was like a gust of wind, not strong, but enough to change the way the two of them viewed the distance between them. For a long time, no one said a word. There was only the metallic sound of the shovel resting against the tree, the sound of the wind sweeping across the ground, and the breathing that each person was trying to keep steady. Marigold turned back to look at the main house. Smoke rose from Harlan's kitchen, thin and faint as pencil strokes. She said something so her voice was almost lost in the wind. "Where I used to live. People always thought I couldn't handle the rigors. They thought I was all about tea parties, zither music, and clean porches. But really, all I wanted was a place where I didn't have to disguise myself." Harlan looked at her for a long time. "I don't want you to have to disguise yourself here." A simple statement, but more powerful than he thought. Marigold turned, her eyes shining with a real light. It wasn't gratitude, nor was it pure joy. It was closer to seeing for the first time after seasons of being misunderstood. She said, her voice slow, as if measuring her heartbeat, "Then I will try to trust this place, and trust my decision to stop." Those words made Harlan stand at an old crossroads he had not dared to cross for a long time. The feeling was not joy, but peace, a feeling he thought he had lost along with his loved ones. The wind blew across the freshly cleared land, carrying with it the scent of freshly turned earth. The scent was like the beginning of something waiting to sprout, though no one dared to name it. Harlan spoke softly, an unspoken promise. "Marigold, if you want, I can replant the apple tree here, not to replace the old one, just to remind you that some things can still start over." Marigold nodded. The softness at the corners of her eyes seemed to warm. "I will help you plant them, and take care of them until they grow." In the middle of the vast Reeves ranch, a small plot of land became the place where two people laid the first brick for something that would change everything. There was an unusual stillness in the air at Reeves Ranch that day. The wind was light but not fresh. The sky was clear, but the light was a little dim, as if something were missing. Marigold felt the change as she washed her dusty hands after planting the first few seeds with Harlan. She heard a strange sound from the trail leading into the ranch, the sound of horses' hooves, a steady rhythm unlike any neighbor who had ever visited. Harlan stepped out of the stable. His eyes turned toward the sound. He was silent for a moment. When the rider came into view, Harlan's expression fell, not in anger, but in alarm. Marigold saw the change and knew at once that this visitor was not a peaceful one. The man wore a dark leather jacket, the dust of the road thick on his trousers. His gaze was as sharp as a battle-hardened blade, used to reading people with a single glance. He pulled on the reins, and the horse stopped near the fence. "Leland Hodge." Harlan spoke slowly, unable to hide his wariness. Marigold froze for a moment at the name. In the small town of Silverton, the name Leland was spoken infrequently, but always in a low voice, as if to avoid awakening anything inappropriate. He was a horse trader, a man with a keen sense of self-interest, who liked to intrude into other people's lives by making them feel indebted. Leland looked around the ranch as if assessing it for anything worth remembering. Then he smiled, an unfriendly smile. "I hear you're taking new people into the ranch." It was more of a guess than a question. Harlan stood up straighter, his body like a wall blocking Leland's eyes from reaching Marigold. "What had brought him here I passed by and remembered he owed me an answer," Leland replied, his voice barely audible. "About the sale of the gray horse I asked you about last month. My price is still there, but I need to know if you've changed your mind." Harlan kept calm. That horse was not for sale. Leland glanced at Marigold, as if trying to gauge her reaction. So she was the reason he changed so much. I had thought Mr. Reeves was the type of person who wouldn't be easily swayed. His every word was like a knife cutting through stone, sharp and cold. Marigold stood behind Harlan, but she did not flinch. She did not tremble. She just kept her gaze straight, not challenging, not bowing, an unassuming toughness. Harlan took a small step forward, just enough to send a message that he wasn't to judge too far. "I didn't like people speculating about my ranch, or about the people who lived here." Leland laughed. "Dry as rotten wood. I guess you have changed. But you should know this, Mr. Reeves. This land is harsh. The weak-hearted do not last long." The remark was directed at Marigold. She sensed the intent, but she felt no attack. She felt something else, pity for someone who used intimidation to maintain her position. She took a half step forward. Harlan turned, but Marigold nodded, signaling that she was okay. Her voice was calm. "You don't need to worry about me, Mr. Hodge. I know my choices." Leland narrowed his eyes at her calmness. She sounded confident, but many who had been as confident as she had ended up returning east in tears. Marigold replied in a voice as soft as silk but not tearful. "I cried enough before I came here. So you need not worry about me falling more on the gravel of the West." That answer made Leland silent for a few seconds. Harlan looked at Marigold, feeling something strange inside him. Not pride, but the feeling that someone stood beside him with their own strength. Leland brushed the dust off his saddle. "Then I'll just say one thing. Those who come hoping to find themselves are often the most disoriented. I just want to see how long you can last." Marigold smiled faintly, not a comforting smile, but the smile of one who knows all too well the darkness in others. "If you wish to see, see, but I was not made to please." Leland grunted and turned his horse. "I'll be back. Mr. Reeves, I hope you won't regret keeping that horse. And for other reasons, too." He jerked the reins, leaving a trail of dust as he left the ranch. The air was quiet again as the sound of hooves faded into the trail. Marigold stood still, her eyes still on the ground Leland had just walked. She wasn't shaking, but there was a thin mist of thought over her gaze. Harlan came to her side. She didn't need to mind his words. "I've known him a long time. He always talks too much to make others doubt himself." "I don't care about what he says," Marigold replied. "I was just thinking that sometimes the presence of someone like that reminds you that you've entered a difficult place." Harlan looked at her. I didn't expect her to face that so soon. Marigold turned, her gaze still soft. I knew what I was choosing. Not to avoid challenges, but to find a place where hardship no longer paralyzed me. He didn't need to change anything to protect me. Just letting me stand by his side was enough. Harlan was speechless for a moment. Something about her words moved his heart in a way he wasn't used to. Someone who didn't ask him to be anything else. Someone who understood that hardship wasn't something to be avoided, but part of being real. He nodded slightly, his voice slow and deep. "Marigold, since you arrived, this ranch has been more than quiet. It has been breathing, of life." Marigold smiled, softer this time. I hoped the sigh would never go away. And in that brief moment, in the vast expanse of Reeves Ranch, two people realized that no matter what the threats from the outside, a bond had begun to take root between them. Quietly, unhurriedly, but strong enough to keep shadows like Leland Hodge from swaying them. The air after Leland left still had a lingering aftertaste, like a fine scratch on the wood, not deep enough to hurt, but enough to be felt. Marigold stood still for a moment, her hand touching the railing. The wood was cold, not because of the weather, but because of the presence of a person making everything heavy. Harlan watched her closely. He didn't speak right away, giving her time to catch her breath. Marigold wasn't the type to flinch under threat, but Harlan could still sense a thin layer of tension around her, like a string tuned higher than normal. He asked slowly, "Are you okay?" Marigold turned. There was no fear in her eyes, only contemplation. "I'm fine. It's just, I forgot there were people who sought to exploit other people's pain to control them." Harlan looked at her a long time before answering. Leland was that kind of man. He liked to see how long people could endure so he could feel strong himself. But she was not like the people he knew. Marigold let out a soft breath, as if to let go of her unfinished thoughts. "Perhaps I was too used to the judging looks. Where I used to live, my appearance was always looked at with judgmental eyes. A woman of even a little beauty would be attached to a series of expectations and speculations, too beautiful to be believed, too beautiful to step out of the mold." Harlan did not reply, but his silence was not heavy, but rather a deep listening born of years of solitude. Marigold was relieved and continued. "They think I'm only good for parties and elegant smiles. No one believes I can wash clothes in a stream, mend a shirt, or clean a barn. No one believes I can lose my family in a tragedy and still be strong. Sometimes I wonder if anyone really sees the person inside me, or if they only see the facade they put up." Harlan felt his chest tighten. He knew what it felt like to be wronged. All his life he had endured the assumption that there must be something wrong with a man who lived so quietly. Silence was seen as coldness, when it was a way of learning not to bother anyone. He spoke softly. I could see clearly that she was not a weak person, not someone who needed to be defined by others. Marigold turned to him, her eyes so clear they made Harlan lower his eyes. Being seen was sometimes more important than being cared for. She said. Harlan swallowed a hard lump of embarrassment. He wasn't used to talking about feelings, much less receiving looks that made him feel valuable. But coming from a woman he didn't dare think he deserved, he changed the subject by inviting her inside. The dirt road leading to the main house was strangely peaceful after Leland's presence. The soil at Reeves' ranch had a way of soothing. Marigold felt it every time she walked on it. It felt like the warmth of the earth seeped through her feet, making everything less sharp. When she reached the porch, she paused to examine the objects hanging there. A frayed rope, gloves with tears from overwork, all told of a man who lived tenaciously, patiently, without show, but never gave up. The silence between them was not tense. It was like two calm streams of water meeting, creating a space for each to contemplate themselves. Harlan said after a few beats, "I'm sorry you had to hear such bad things from Leland." Marigold shook her head. He couldn't be held responsible for what others said. What interested me was how he stood between me and him. He didn't say much, but I felt that protectiveness. Harlan paused. I just didn't want her to think she was alone at the ranch. Marigold noticed his voice was lower than usual, as if he weighed each word. She knew he did not say such things lightly. He was not the type of man to use flowery words to curry favor. Every word he spoke was sincere. She asked very softly, "Harlan, what do you fear most about me being here?" He didn't expect that, but Harlan Reeves wasn't one to shy away from the truth. He looked at his hands before answering. "I'm afraid I'm not enough for you to stay. Not because I lack anything, but because I've been so used to silence for so long. I'm afraid I won't know how to hold someone who isn't used to being alone like me." Marigold felt her heart sink, but not from sadness. It was the feeling of one who has touched a rare truth. A man from the West who could withstand sandstorms was afraid of losing what he did not dare to claim as his. She answered after a long silence. "His silence didn't scare me. I was afraid something inside me was making him back down." Harlan looked up at her. In that moment, there was an unspoken recognition between them. They were both afraid, but it wasn't each other they were afraid of. It was the past that had taught them to guard against happiness. The atmosphere between them softened, not weak, but deep, like still water with many layers of waves underneath. Marigold stepped out onto the porch, touching a small potted plant Harlan had placed there. She said, without turning, "I've never seen a place like this. A place where I can breathe. Not because there's no one around, but because I don't have to act in front of anyone." Harlan walked to the door and leaned against the wooden frame. She didn't need to act here. Never. A wind rich with the scent of dry grass blew by. Marigold let her hair flow with it, her shoulders relaxing. Something inside her loosened, like a string around her heart finally coming loose. She turned back, her voice deep and calm. "Harlan, I don't know what the future holds, but I want to give this place a chance, and give you a chance." Harlan didn't answer right away, but his eyes darkened as if Reevesland were there. A man who had lost almost everything important sometimes needed time to believe in something new. But he heard every word she said, and for the first time, he didn't shy away from the feeling growing inside him. The time after Leland's encounter felt like a thin layer of mist still lingering on the ceiling of Reeves' ranch. Not heavy, but enough to remind them both that peace in the West was always fragile. Harlan spent more time around the ranch, not to keep an eye on anyone, but to make sure Marigold felt like she belonged, undisturbed by uninvited shadows from his past. Marigold noticed it. The way Harlan slowed down as he passed the kitchen door. The way he took in everything in her line of sight. No pressure, just a quiet presence as warm as an old sweater. Sometimes she saw him standing in the yard, his hand on the old wooden saddle, as if wondering if he was getting too close, or too fast. Once, as she was washing small china dishes in the sink with warm water, he walked to the table and put his hands on the wooden edge. She did not turn around, but she knew he was there. He asked, "How are you feeling today?" Marigold smiled slightly. "I felt like I was getting to know this place better." Everything here spoke without words. Harlan nodded. The West did not speak loudly. Those who understood it had to listen. Marigold dropped the handkerchief she was holding and turned around. I realized something. Maybe I needed to learn to listen to him the way I listened to this place. Harlan paused. He wasn't used to hearing direct emotional speech, but Marigold wasn't saying it to force him to respond. She was saying it because she felt he deserved it. Harlan missed her gaze. Her eyes were as deep as a still lake, where you could see the bottom, not just the reflection on the surface, and he knew he wanted her to read his silence, even though it was something he had never let anyone else do. The two continued working in the kitchen, their companionship gentle, as if they had shared the same roof for a long time, even though they had only known each other for a few weeks. Another day. Marigold brought a chair out onto the porch and used a needle and thread to mend Harlan's thick coat. They sat in silence. The only sound was the rustle of fabric against her hands and the distant sound of horses in the stables. Harlan watched her bend down, her hair falling softly and peacefully along her neck. He spoke up. "You don't have to work so hard. Some things I can take care of myself." Marigold looked up, her smile like smoke. "I knew he could, but I wanted to keep my hands busy. When one has suffered loss, keeping one's hands busy is sometimes a way to keep one's mind from thinking too much." Harlan recognized the pain behind the words, a pain that was crusted over with age, but still warm inside. He asked slowly, "Before, had she worked and forgotten something?" Marigold set her shirt down on her lap, looking out at the distant hills. "I spent a year sweeping and mopping. I kept doing one thing after another so I wouldn't have to sit still and face the loss of my family. They say time is a healer. I think time just pulls back the curtain so I can see more clearly how much I've been hurt." Harlan did not interrupt. He knew the emptiness so well that even the slightest gust of wind made him tired. He too had gathered logs and hammered together planks of wood so he would not have to face an empty bed in a house too big for one person. Marigold continued in a low voice. "When I came here, I didn't know what I could rebuild, but you made me think, maybe I don't have to rebuild alone." Her words made Harlan's chest tighten. He turned away to hide his embarrassment, but Marigold noticed. "I don't mean to embarrass you," she added. "I just want you to know that I'm not afraid of your silence. I'm more afraid of my own silence, of living among people who don't give me the right to speak." Harlan rested his hands on the arms of his chair. His voice was low, unhurried. "I don't want you to feel pressured to say anything. If there's anything you need, just say it." Marigold looked at the veined hand resting on the wood, a hand that had worked all its life, had endured cuts and calluses, but it rested there gently, as if afraid to put pressure on her. She answered softly, "I will speak when necessary." But his presence sometimes said more than words. One day recently, after helping Harlan carry the last bag of hay into the barn, Marigold stood looking out at the open field before her. The sky was neither clear nor overcast. The color was pale and flat like an old canvas. She asked, "Harlan, how long have you lived here?" He followed her gaze. "Almost 20 years. Since my father died, I stayed to guard the land. I gradually got used to being alone." Marigold pursed her lips. She sensed the implication. He did not say it, but she understood. A man who did not leave a place where he had seen loss meant he had loved deeply, truly, and had suffered a sadness that the West silently held for him. She asked again, "Have you ever thought about leaving?" Harlan shook his head slowly. "If I left, this place would be empty. No one would hold on to my parents' story. I didn't want what they built to be blown away by the wind." Marigold felt something soften in her chest. She spoke slowly and firmly. Someone who has kept something so precious for so many years is not someone who lets go easily. I treasure that. Harlan bowed his head slightly, as if the words were so real, so close, that he had to hold his breath before taking them in. They walked together toward the main house. Marigold stopped as she passed the old cypress tree by the stables. The cypress stood tall, its trunk gnarled by time and storms. She put her hand on the trunk, feeling the coolness of the wood. She sighed softly. This tree looked like it had been here longer than anyone. Harlan said, "It's been there since my grandfather's time. Everyone said it would only survive a few decades on this land, but it keeps standing. Sometimes I think, this tree is like how people endure, not because it's strong, but because it has no choice but to stay." Marigold was silent. She looked at the tree, then at the man standing beside it. Two images merged in her mind, one that endured, one that waited, one that did not leave through storms or scorching suns. She asked, "Harlan, do you see yourself like this tree?" He replied very softly, "Maybe." Marigold put her hand on his arm, a movement so light it felt like a breeze. She said, "The tree stands there because no one else holds it. But you are different. You still have a choice. You can choose to open the door to the person who wants to stay." Harlan looked at her hand. Nothing to say in that moment, but his heart moved, a quiet, deep, directed movement. One calm day. Harlan took out his old harness and found Marigold standing at the edge of the stable, stroking the mane of Chestnut, the largest horse on the farm. Chestnut was a reserved horse, yet he stood still and let her touch him. Harlan stopped, feeling as if he were witnessing something rare. Marigold turned, her eyes soft. The horse looked fierce, yet was unusually gentle. She looked at me as if she understood what I was saying. Harlan answered softly. Chestnut trusted no one but me, yet he let her get close. Maybe he recognized her temperament. Marigold smiled. I think sometimes animals understand the human heart better than we understand each other. Harlan started to reply but stopped. Something about that statement threw him off balance, partly because it was true, partly because he sensed the invisible bridge between them beginning to form. A breeze blew. Marigold tucked her thin scarf around her neck. Harlan put down the coiled reins and took a step closer. He spoke in a low, unhurried voice. The temperature was dropping fast. She should put on a coat. She chuckled. I know, but here, the air was sobering. Like every breath of wind carried a reminder to be honest with one's feelings. The words made Harlan's heart slow, then speed up. Marigold wasn't talking about him, but he knew she was opening a way for him to step into something closer. In that moment, in the front yard, amid the smell of hay and horsehide, Harlan felt something clearly. His silence, which he had always considered a wall, was becoming a barrier to someone who wanted to understand him. He spoke up. Marigold, there's something I want to ask. She tilted her head. Yes. He searched for his words slowly. I knew you had been through a lot before coming to Reeves Ranch, but I wanted to know, what gave you the courage to leave it all behind? To come to a foreign land like this, someone like you could have chosen a more comfortable place to live, a life with less hardship. Marigold looked down at her hands, brushing the grass clippings from her skirt. She answered each word as if recalling the path that had brought her here. I did not choose the place with less hardship. Harlan, I chose the place with a chance to start over. The city where I lived was crowded with people, but had no one to cling to. Every time I entered the house of my previous owner, all I heard was my footsteps echoing and then fading away. I felt myself disappearing into that space. Harlan knew the disappearance well. He had lived for years with the silence that ate away at the wood. Marigold continued, When I saw the mail order ad for a wife, I thought it was the craziest thing I'd ever done. But sometimes the craziest thing opens the only door to life. I don't expect to find a perfect life. I only hope to find a life with human warmth. Harlan wanted to say something, but his throat tightened. He thought he was the one bringing her to safety. It turned out she was saving him too. Marigold looked straight at him. I came here because I believe that a man who writes a sincere letter, even if it is short, still has a heart. Harlan breathed slowly, feeling as if layers of dirt and rock were being lifted from his heart. He said, I don't know how much of that heart I can hold. Marigold did not hesitate. He kept more than he thought. He stayed on the land his parents left him. He cared for each animal in the barn. He faced troublemakers and remained calm. He was not empty-hearted. Harlan looked at her for a long time. His voice was lower than usual. Marigold, aren't you afraid I'm too quiet? She replied as softly as a towel dropped to the wooden floor. I fear those who talk too much to hide their empty insides. And silence is sometimes a sign of kindness holding its shape. Harlan turned away for a moment to steady himself. He wasn't used to having someone read him so clearly, so deeply, but he didn't want to hide. When he turned back, he found Marigold still standing next to Chestnut, her hand on the horse's mane, waiting for him to say what he had never said to anyone. He sighed softly. I'm not good at expressing my thoughts. All my life I've been working and keeping things to myself. Sometimes I'm afraid, if I open my mouth, I'll reveal the weakness I've kept hidden for years. Marigold moved closer, keeping enough distance so he wouldn't feel cornered. Being vulnerable wasn't a bad thing. It just proved he was human. A moment of silence passed. Harlan felt his heart soften. He knew he was learning to stand beside her. Not shy away, Marigold asked. Harlan, if you don't open your heart, how will you know if someone can touch the best part of you? He took a deep breath. I don't know, but maybe it's time I tried. Harlan reached up, intending to touch the horse's neck, but the motion stopped mid-move. His hand shifted, resting very lightly on the back of Marigold's hand. Not too tight, not too close, just enough to say he no longer wanted to back away. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes flickering, but not leaving him. Her voice was soft. I'm here. Harlan, which means I'm not going anywhere. That moment did not need the sound of wind, the sound of horse hooves, or promises. It only needed two people who had suffered enough loss to understand that trusting each other was the first step to resurrection. From the moment Harlan's hand touched Marigold's, the space between them changed. It was unclear, not rushed, but the silence after each sentence was no longer a barrier. It was like a small pause for the heart to understand what the eyes were seeing. One afternoon, the wind carried the scent of dry earth, and Harlan led Marigold to the plot behind the barn. It was there that he often planted test crops that he knew would not survive, but he tried anyway. The short grasses were blown in soft curves like the lines of someone's hand. Marigold stopped before the small patch of earth he had plowed. She sat down and scooped up a handful of dirt. It was crumbly, fine, dry on top but moist beneath. She spoke slowly. The soil was more like a human heart than he had thought. The top was hard and dry, but deeper down there was a soft layer where seeds could grow. Harlan stood beside her, leaning on the shovel. He looked at her, his eyes filled with emotion. I've tried planting 3 seasons without success. Sometimes I think, some things are better kept than planted. Marigold put the soil down and brushed it off. Not because the soil was unsuitable, but because he planted it when his heart was not ready for anyone to enter. Seeds must be planted when the heart is open. Harlan was silent for a moment. He crouched down beside her. He said, "So you think?" Now is the time. Marigold looked at him, her eyes deep and bright, as if reflecting the changing sky in the distance. She answered softly, "I don't know when the right time is. I just know there are things that must begin before people are afraid." That made something in Harlan relax, like a string tuned to the right tune. He pulled a small bag of beads from his coat pocket and held it out to her. "Maybe we can try again." Together, they dug small holes, dropped seeds, and covered them with soil in slow, even movements. Neither of them spoke, but they both felt a strange calmness. It was as if the land had been waiting for them. As they stood, the wind picked up a bit, carrying the scent of freshly pressed earth through the air. Marigold squinted at the distant trees, then turned to Harlan. She said, "Harlan, do you ever feel like you're learning to live again?" He answered truthfully, "I had lived all these years just getting through the seasons, but lately, I've been catching myself noticing things I'd long overlooked, like the way other people look at the sun." Marigold was a little surprised. "Sun direction?" Harlan slowly pointed toward the horizon. People who had suffered a lot often had a habit of looking down when they walked, but she always looked toward the light, no matter how strong or weak it was. Marigold smiled softly, her smile as soft as the wool blanket draped over the chair before the fireplace. "I looked toward the light because I knew the darkness was always waiting behind me. I didn't want it to catch up with me again." Harlan looked at her for a long time, then said, "I think light is more what you bring to others than what you seek." Marigold bowed her head a beat. "I wasn't sure. I just knew I wanted to live a life that didn't involve running from fear." Their conversation continued, without raising their voices, without emphasis. Each word they exchanged seemed to touch the dry soil in their hearts and awaken something that had been dormant for too long. As they walked home, Marigold asked hesitantly, "Harlan, have you ever thought that our emotions are stronger than we care to admit?" Harlan answered truthfully, "My whole life had been about not admitting how I felt. It was my way of keeping things together after losing so much, but I was beginning to fear that if I kept it all in, it would rot inside me." Marigold looked at him deeply. No one loves by burying everything inside. That made Harlan pause. He wasn't angry or embarrassed, just felt it was too true to argue. He spoke softly. "I'm not used to it, but I'm trying." Marigold nodded slightly. "I saw that. That was enough for me to stay." The words weren't a promise, but they reached a place Harlan had never let anyone else go. When they reached the porch, he opened the door for her. Marigold entered, her eyes sweeping the cabin with a familiarity she hadn't felt a few weeks ago. She placed her hands on the edge of the table and said, "I have something to ask, but I'm afraid you'll think I'm overstepping my bounds." Harlan pulled out a chair and sat down as if preparing to hear something important. She spoke. Marigold took a deep breath as if gathering strength. "If someone like me, if I, were in no hurry to leave this place, would that bother you?" The question was a slow arrow that went straight to the heart of the matter. Harlan looked at her, his eyes dark, but not with worry. They were with recognition. He answered, each word sure and true. "Marigold, Your presence here is not a bother. It makes Reeves Ranch less empty. It makes me less lost in my own life." Marigold bit her lower lip, emotion rising and taking a beat to keep her voice from shaking. "So, does that mean you want me to stay?" Harlan didn't shy away. "I want you to stay, if it won't hurt or distract you." Marigold took a step forward. "It only pained me to leave places that made me feel seen. And here, I saw more than I expected." Harlan stood. He stepped closer to her, not close enough to make her nervous, but close enough for her to feel the warmth of a man who had endured half a lifetime of weariness. He spoke so softly it was like a prayer. "Marigold, I don't know what the future holds, but I know, if anyone deserves my whole heart to listen, it's you." Marigold clasped her hands to her chest, as if to keep her heart from racing too fast. She looked at him, her eyes soft and bright, but with the depth of someone who has been wounded and is learning to trust again. "Harlan, I don't need your promises. I just need to know you won't push me away." Harlan reached up, touched her sleeve lightly. "Not skin, just presence. I wouldn't push her away." The wind from the porch blew through the window, making the thin curtains sway slightly, as if the house itself were breathing a sigh of relief, a beginning that needed no announcement but was noticeable to everyone. No need to rush, but each step was sure. The next few days passed with a strange calm. Not exactly calm, but like a large lake that is calmed after someone tossed a pebble and created a few soft ripples. Marigold grew accustomed to the routine of Reeves Ranch. She worked beside Harlan without being told to. She would just see him carrying a crate, and she would follow behind with soft gloves. She would just see him inspecting the fence, and she would walk with him to the end of the long stretch of land. Harlan didn't ask her to do anything. He just let her do her thing. And whenever she stood beside him, he smelled the wood a home, hay, earth, and a new scent he couldn't name, a scent that warmed his chest, made the heavy work less heavy. One day, while Harlan was fixing a loose barn door hinge, Marigold came in with a small basket. She set it down on the wooden step and said, "I'll make some honey and ginger water. Drink it and then continue." Her tone wasn't commanding, but it wasn't exactly suggestive either. It was the way someone who's used to caring would talk to someone they care about. Harlan took the bowl and raised it to his lips. The warmth spread down his throat. He said thank you in a low voice. Marigold smiled slightly and sat on a nearby rock. She watched him hammer the wood. Harlan worked with quiet concentration, each stroke even and decisive, a display of steadfastness and care. Marigold looked at his hands, old calluses and new scratches, then at his face, calm, but with a deep layer of weariness that had accumulated over the years. She asked softly, "Harlan, do you ever feel like you've sacrificed too much for this country?" Harlan stopped hammering and looked up at her. It wasn't a look of annoyance, but of thoughtfulness. After a moment, he said, "Sometimes I think I have no choice. This is what I have left of my family. It's not just land. It's a story. If I leave, that story's gone." Marigold nodded. She understood. There were places where people were bound not only by memories, but also by a kind of duty that no one forced, but no one dared to let go. She said, "I often think people stay in a place not just because of the land, but because they believe it can heal something in them." "Do you think Reeves Ranch is healing you?" Harlan looked at the expanse of land, then at his hands as if reflecting on the years. He spoke slowly. "I don't know if it will heal, but it gives me a reason to continue." Marigold sighed softly. He had never asked himself if he deserved to be healed. Had Harlan paused, it wasn't what he expected, but it was so true that it made his heart flutter like a tap. He didn't answer at once. It took him a long time to say anything. "I hadn't thought about it." Marigold nodded. "I understood. People who have suffered great loss often think they just need to move on, not find peace." A long silence stretched between them like a taut rope. Then Marigold stood up and brushed her skirts. She looked up at the sky. Thick clouds rolled in on the far horizon. The color was like smeared ink. She said, "Something in the air tells me there will be a change in the weather tonight." Harlan looked that way. Yes, the wind had changed, but he wasn't worried about a storm. What worried him was the feeling inside him, the feeling that something was about to happen, not because of the heavens, but because he was getting too close to something he had never dared to touch. He turned to her, intending to say something, but before the words could form, they heard the sound of hooves from the road. The sound was not too loud, but not too light, a beat enough to tell that the rider was moving with a clear purpose. Harlan frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone today. Marigold clasped her hands together slightly. The feeling of unease from the dark clouds now poured down on her. Harlan stepped closer to the fence, his eyes on the path leading to the ranch. Marigold stood a few steps behind him, not touching, but close enough for him to know she wanted to know what was coming. A man on a black horse approached and stopped a few yards from them. There was a faint smile on his face, which the stranger could not tell whether it was friendly or ironic. He took off his hat and greeted them both in a drawling voice. "Good morning, Mr. Reeves, and good morning, Miss Evans?" Marigold stiffened. The greeting was too familiar, too much like the way someone who knew her used to say her name to make her lose her composure. She said nothing, just straightened her back, as if to hide the slight tremor rising in her chest. Harlan asked, "What do you need here?" He looked at Marigold longer than necessary before answering. "I just wanted to see if the woman who left town without leaving any message was doing well." Harlan took a half step forward, his eyes cold. He was not to come near her. He raised an eyebrow. "I was just asking. After all, we had known each other." Marigold clenched her hands until her knuckles turned white. She said, her voice low but clear, "I don't want you here." He looked at her, his eyes unreadable. Not anger, not joy, just assessment. Then he turned to Harlan. "Looks like Mr. Reeves doesn't like people around." Harlan replied, "I don't like anyone intentionally making people at this ranch feel unsafe." He let out a short chuckle. "A ranch person." He made it sound like she belonged to him. Harlan did not respond to the provocation. He was not the kind of man to raise his voice or show force in front of a woman he cared about. He simply stood tall, his eyes calm as only someone who had endured hardship could. Marigold stepped forward, standing parallel to Harlan, not hiding behind him, not cowering, just standing with him in a silent declaration. She spoke to him more firmly than before. "I am not going back to town, nor am I going back to where you think I should be. I am here because I choose to be." He was silent for a few seconds, then shrugged. "If that is your choice, I will leave you here. But remember, Marigold, this is not paradise. This West is not easy to hope for." Harlan replied in a low voice. "Hope does not need favorable conditions to survive. It only needs the right person to hold it." He realized he was not winning this conversation. He turned his horse, glanced at Marigold one last time, and spurred it away from the ranch, leaving behind the heavy clop of its hooves. As he disappeared, Marigold exhaled as if she had held her breath too long. Harlan turned to her and asked softly, "Are you okay?" Marigold nodded. "I'm fine, just a little surprised that the past managed to follow me all the way here." Harlan put his hand on her shoulder, not hard but enough to let her know he was on her side. He said, "The past only has power if you let it. Here, it can't touch you anymore." Tears welled up in Marigold's eyes, not from pain, but from being defended so calmly. She said, "Thank you. Harlan, I've never had anyone stand by me like this." He looked at her, his eyes warm but restrained. She didn't have to face it alone anymore. After the stranger left Reeves' ranch, the space between Marigold and Harlan became heavy. Not uncomfortably heavy, but heavy in the way two people stand before a half-open door and wonder if they have the courage to walk through it together. Marigold was silent for a long time. She did not avoid Harlan's gaze, but she did not rush to say what was swirling in her heart. She looked down at her mud-covered canvas shoes, a small act that showed she was gathering strength to face the things she had usually buried deep. Harlan stood beside her, not touching her, but not leaving her side. He had learned that Marigold needed time to say what hurt her. He waited patiently, as he waited patiently through the seasons when the soil refused to sprout. Finally, Marigold raised her face. Her voice was low and slightly hoarse. "That person was no longer important to me. My past with him had trapped me in a feeling that was difficult to escape." Harlan just said, "I'm listening." Marigold took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I was engaged to a man in Salt Fern, not because I loved him, but because I thought marriage meant having a place to stay, a place where I wouldn't have to wander like I did after a family tragedy." She paused for a beat. Harlan did not intervene. "But that man changed very quickly when he knew I was not an easy woman. He wanted to control everything. From the way I dressed, talked to who I smiled at in the street, I thought I could handle it. But day by day, I felt more and more suffocated." Marigold looked out at the land ahead, her eyes slightly teary. "He didn't hit me, but he made me believe that I was never good enough to be loved if I didn't listen to him. That hurt, made me leave." Harlan felt his chest tighten, not from jealousy or anger, but from imagining the pain she must have felt. the silence she kept, the fear of choosing her life again. He spoke slowly. She didn't go because she was weak. She went because she was strong enough not to be wrong with herself. Tears streamed down Marigold's cheeks, not because she was sad, but because someone had seen through her in ways she had never told anyone. I was always afraid that I would make the same mistake again, afraid that one day someone would make me unrecognizable again. Harlan felt the words burst from his chest, but he held back so as not to overwhelm her. He spoke, his voice hoarse. I won't make you into someone else. I've lived long enough to know that you can only love someone if you let them be themselves. Marigold looked at him a long time. There was no defense in her glassy blue eyes now. There was only gratitude and something growing slowly but strongly. She said, Harlan, you have no idea. When you stood before me today, when you said I didn't have to face it alone, it made me feel seen in a way I never had before. Harlan squeezed his hand lightly as if to balance the rising emotion in his chest. He wanted to say that she made him see himself too, but that was too much to say just yet. Instead, he took a step closer to her. Marigold did not back away. She stood still, letting Harlan's presence envelop her like a thick coat in the turning chill. Harlan said, If that person comes back, I won't let him near you. Not because I want to be strong, but because I know how much it took you to escape that past. Marigold nodded, leaning into his warmth. I wasn't afraid he had come to do me harm. What scared me was that he reminded me that I had once been someone with nowhere to return to. Harlan spoke, each word firmly. Reeves Ranch wasn't a temporary place. It could be a place where she could start over. Marigold closed her eyes, as if his words had struck a chord with her. There was a long silence between them, but it was not a silence of distance. It was a silence of acknowledgement. They both knew they were entering emotional territory, though neither had yet spoken it aloud. A distant clap of thunder cracked softly in the sky. Not loud, but enough to break the tension in the air. Marigold opened her eyes and looked up at the darker clouds. A storm might indeed be coming. Harlan looked at the clouds, then at her. We should go inside before the wind picks up. Marigold nodded, but didn't move. She stood for a moment, her hand lightly touching the wooden table beside the porch, as if trying to hold on to the peace for just a moment longer. Then she turned back toward the door. As they entered, a small lamp hanging on the wall glowed warmly, creating a soft glow that made the room seem cocoon. Marigold placed her shawl on a chair, then stood by the window watching the sky darken. She said, her voice low but firm, Harlan, thank you for standing beside me then. Harlan replied, I did what everyone should have done. Marigold shook her head. Not everyone chooses to side with the hurting. I know that better than anyone. Harlan looked at her, then said, Marigold, since you came here, I realized I no longer lived just to maintain the ranch. I started thinking about something else, what I thought was no longer a part of my life. She turned, but Harlan was silent for a few seconds, then replied in a voice as small as solid ground, about letting someone into your life without fear of them leaving. The words made Marigold stand still. She did not cry, but her eyes were wet. It was not a loud emotion, but rather the kind of emotion that comes from someone who has suffered so much that when happiness comes, they receive it with the deepest silence. She moved closer, so softly that her footsteps were almost silent. A very small distance remained between them. She asked, her voice almost a whisper, and he thought, that person could be me. Harlan looked into the trembling blue eyes. Years of loss had made him afraid to admit anything beautiful, but now he found the courage to speak the truth. He said, without hesitation, I think it was you. Marigold took a deep breath, her lips trembling slightly. But it wasn't a tremble of fear. It was the tremble of someone who felt loved in a way they thought was no longer theirs. She didn't rush at him. She didn't hug him. She just placed her palm on his chest, right where his heart was pounding with the truth. Then she spoke, softly but deeply. I am not ready to love again, but I am ready to let my heart learn to trust. And I want to learn that with you. Harlan placed his hand on hers, holding a moment between two people who once thought they had no right to hope. He said, Marigold, I will go at the pace your heart can bear. No faster, no slower. Outside, the wind whistled through the roof, signaling an approaching storm. But in the log cabin of Reeves Ranch, something else was beginning to form, an admission that wasn't yet a promise, but enough to change the way two people viewed their lives from here on out. The rain had long since stopped, leaving only the smell of dirt clinging to the wooden beams of Reeves Ranch. After the strong wind had passed, and the air seemed to have been washed clean, revealing new streaks of light filtering through the pine trees in the front yard. Marigold stood by the window, her hands clasped together, her gaze following the mist on the glass. Her conversation with Harlan still echoed softly in her mind, like a melody held back after the last syllable had hit the ground. Harlan stepped inside, carrying the smell of wet grass and the lingering chill from the porch. He set his coat on a wooden hanger and looked at Marigold for a moment. The peace in her eyes reminded him of the rare moment when a wild animal will stand still and let someone approach, not because it has been subdued, but because it has believed no one will harm it anymore. Marigold turned to the sound of his footsteps, soft, but enough to let her know he was there. It was strange how, after only a few months, she had grown accustomed to his presence, a natural part of the house. It felt like she didn't have to hide from anyone, or try to hide her thoughts. It was something she had thought she would never have. She asked, "Are the calves outside okay?" Harlan nodded. "They're recovering pretty quickly. I think this rain hasn't brought the cold, so it's not as dangerous as previous years." He paused, then continued. "And you, Marigold, are you okay?" Marigold understood what he was trying to say. She slowed down, standing a few steps away from him. She no longer felt the need to hide her emotions. She said she was tired, but tired because she was having to sort through old things in her heart. "It wasn't bad. It was just strange," Harlan replied. "Strange sometimes means you are entering new territory without the fear you had before." Marigold smiled slightly, a smile that softened her face, revealing the gentleness of a woman who had suffered much loss but still retained compassion. She asked again, "What about you? What we said last night? Did it weigh on your heart?" He shook his head slightly. "Not heavily. Just felt like I was starting to want to protect something meaningful. Something I hadn't dared to think about before." Marigold looked at him closely. The wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, traces of the years, no longer looked like fatigue but proof of quiet strength. She realized that the sense of security in her heart came from that simple but sincere look. She said, "I've wandered around, looking for a place to call home, but it's never been enough. But here, I'm starting to feel something else. I think maybe Reeves Ranch is the place where I can put my heart back down without fear." Harlan felt his chest warm. He didn't pull her into his arms, didn't say anything too loud, just asked softly, "Marigold, are you willing to stay?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes, but not because she needed a place to stay, but because I felt I could contribute to something here, something we both wanted to make better." The silence that followed didn't last long. Harlan reached out to her, slowly, as if asking for permission. Marigold placed her hand in his, a small gesture that held a trust she had hidden for so long. The moment felt like the official mark of the rebirth they'd both been waiting for. The meeting in the town church was a simple affair. None of them wanted a big wedding, for each understood the value of silence after such a great event. Father Longton smiled kindly and said he had never seen a couple look at each other with such gratitude. Marigold did not wear an elaborate white dress, but a soft ivory dress, paired with a hand-woven cape. Harlan stood beside her, his dark hair streaked with silver, giving him the mature air of someone who had suffered enough to understand the value of a meaningful choice. After a brief but firm kiss, the townspeople stepped forward to congratulate them. No one asked why them. Just by looking at the way Marigold stood next to Harlan, by the look in his eyes as he handed her the ring, one could tell they had found their place. On the way back to Reeves Ranch, Marigold sat in the wagon, leaning lightly on Harlan's shoulder. The wind blew around them, carrying the scent of newly revived grass after the rain. She said softly, "I don't think I can love again. Not because I don't want to, but because I used to believe that anything beautiful can disappear so quickly. But with you, I found I wanted to open my heart a little more." Harlan placed his hand on hers. "I don't expect you to love me right away. I just hope that we choose to be together naturally every day. If love is true, it will grow on its own, without forcing it." Marigold tilted her head at him. "Harlan, do you know how to say things that make people feel at peace?" He smiled faintly. "I only say what I believe." In the days that followed, their lives did not change abruptly. They did not rush into each other with hasty passion, nor did they let their feelings lie dormant. Everything progressed at a slow pace that two middle-aged hearts could endure without fear of being swept away. Marigold tended the backyard garden, clearing patches of land to plant more daisies and thyme. She said plants softened the heart, and Harlan said just watching her bend down to tie the pony's shoelaces made his home brighter. One day, as the last light of day colored the valley, Harlan brought out an old wooden box. He said it was something he had kept after his greatest loss, when his wife and daughter died of the plague. Inside was a small, never-used woolen scarf. He handed it to Marigold and said, "I kept it because I thought I had no one else to love. But now, I think you can keep it as a sign that I'm ready to start over." Marigold trembled slightly as she touched the soft yarn. She knew it was not inanimate. It was the remnant of a father who had lost everything, and now dared to share it with her. Tears fell from her eyes, but her smile remained. She said, "Harlan, I will keep it, not as a memento of who it was, but as a symbol of what we are building, something new, something for both of us." Harlan couldn't help but pull her into his arms. Not a declaration hug, but the hug of someone who had found the last piece of their life. At that moment, he knew he had stepped out of the darkness of loneliness without losing the memory of his ex. Because new love does not erase old pain. It only helps people not be stuck in it anymore. Over the next season, Reeves Ranch gradually filled with new sounds. Marigold's laughter as the hens ran around the yard. Harlan's voice calling to her from the barn, deep but strangely warm. And sometimes, when the sky was clear, they would sit together on the porch, silently staring at the sky, as if knowing that the silence between them was a rare form of happiness. Marigold placed her hand on Harlan's and said, "This place is truly home now." Harlan looked at her with eyes as gentle as the first breeze of the season, then softly replied, "Not because the ranch is large or the land is beautiful, but because she is here." The two of them didn't need to say anything more, because when two hearts that had suffered so much loss met at the right time, words were sometimes just unnecessary. What mattered was the presence, the peace, and the choice to continue to accompany each other the next day. Reeves Ranch is no longer just a piece of land in the Wild West. It becomes a place where two people heal, where the past no longer holds sway, the future no longer seems uncertain, and the present is filled with a warmth they thought was lost forever. There are losses that seem to lock people's hearts forever, but Harlan and Marigold's story reminds us that even when we are halfway through life, we still have the right to live again, to love again, and to heal in ways we never dared to believe. Love in old age is not noisy, not hasty. It is a daily choice. It is a trust given slowly but surely. And more importantly, it is the courage to face the past to make way for the future. Life can change in a single moment, a glance, a hand extended at the right moment, a chance to stay instead of leaving. We can all find warmth at any age if we don't close our hearts too tightly. Thank you for taking the time to watch this story. If you find this content helpful or hopeful, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support is the driving force for more stories to be told.